It was June 1968, and Elvis Presley was making his comeback after years away from performing. Jimi Hendrix showed up uninvited to the rehearsal. "Your voice is powerful," Jimi said, "but can it do this?" What he played made Elvis stop his entire comeback rehearsal. Elvis hadn't performed live in front of an audience since 1961, 7 years of bad movies, soundtrack albums that nobody cared about, and watching the Beatles take over the world he'd created. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had kept him locked into a Hollywood contract that was slowly killing his artistic soul. But now, finally, NBC had offered him a special, a chance to remind America why they'd called him the king in the first place. The rehearsals were taking place at NBC's Burbank Studios, Studio 4 to be exact. It was a closed set, no press, no guests, just Elvis and his core team. The band consisted of musicians he trusted, Scotty Moore on guitar, DJ Fontana on drums, and a few session players who'd worked with him in the Memphis days. The director, Steve Binder, wanted to capture something raw, something that proved Elvis could still command a stage. Elvis was nervous in a way that nobody had seen him nervous before. He was 33 years old but felt older. The movies had taken something from him, the edge, the danger, the sexual electricity that had made him revolutionary. He'd spent the morning running through songs, trying to find his voice again, literally and figuratively. Around 2 in the afternoon, during a break, someone from security came into the studio and whispered something to Steve Binder. Steve's eyes widened and he walked over to Elvis, who was drinking water and toweling off sweat. "Elvis, you're not going to believe this, but Jimi Hendrix is outside. He wants to watch the rehearsal." Elvis stopped mid-sip. "Jimi Hendrix? The guy who sets guitars on fire?" "That's him. He says he's a huge fan, wants to see the king work." Elvis had heard Hendrix's music on the radio, Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, that wild, distorted sound that was taking over FM stations. It was so different from everything Elvis had done. Where Elvis had been smooth and controlled, Jimi was chaos and raw power. Where Elvis had made the guitar a supporting player to his voice, Jimi made the guitar the star of the show. "Let him in," Elvis said, "but he sits in the back. I don't need distractions." 5 minutes later, Jimi Hendrix walked into Studio 4. He was wearing a psychedelic shirt, bell-bottoms, and carrying his Stratocaster in a soft case. His afro was magnificent, his presence undeniable. Several people in the room stopped what they were doing to stare. Elvis was back on stage, working through "That's All Right," one of his early Sun Records hits. He was trying to recapture the looseness, the joy he'd felt when he was 19 and nobody knew what rock and roll was supposed to be. His voice was still incredible. That baritone could drop low and rich, then suddenly shoot up to a tenor that had emotional power most singers spent their whole lives trying to find. Jimi sat in the back row of seats, watching intently. Elvis finished the song, and Steve Binder called for another take. They ran through it again, Elvis trying different vocal phrasings, different ways of attacking the lyrics. After the third take, Elvis noticed Jimi in the back. "You the guitar player everyone's talking about?" Jimi stood up. "Yes, sir. Jimi Hendrix." "Sir," Elvis repeated with a slight smile. "You don't need to sir me. What brings you to my rehearsal?" "I wanted to see how the king prepares. I grew up listening to your records. Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Heartbreak Hotel. Those songs changed my life." Elvis seemed genuinely moved by this. "Well, that's kind of you to say. But I've heard your music too. You're doing things with the guitar that I didn't know were possible." "Just trying to make it sing," Jimi said. "That's the thing, though," Elvis said, stepping to the edge of the stage. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately. All these new bands, you, Cream, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, you're putting the guitar front and center, making it the voice.
But I don't think an instrument can ever replace what a human voice can do. A voice carries soul in a way strings and wood can't." The room got quieter. People sensed something happening, though nobody was quite sure what. "You think a guitar can't have soul?" Jimi asked carefully. "I think a guitar can have technique, it can have power, but soul, emotion that makes people cry, that comes from here." Elvis put his hand on his chest. "From the voice, from a human being expressing what they feel. Your guitar is impressive, don't get me wrong, but it's still just an instrument. My voice is me." Jimi thought about this for a moment. "Can I show you something?" Elvis gestured to the stage. "Be my guest." Jimi walked up with his guitar case, opened it, and pulled out his white Stratocaster. He plugged into one of the spare amps on stage, adjusted a few settings, then looked at Elvis. "What's a song that means something to you, something emotional?" Elvis didn't have to think long. "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" I recorded it in 1960. It's about loss, about wondering if someone you loved still thinks about you. "Sing a little of it for me," Jimi said. Elvis, somewhat bemused by this turn of events, sang the opening verse, no accompaniment, just his voice, filling the studio with that warm, aching baritone. When he finished the line, "Are you lonesome tonight?" there was a vulnerability in his voice that reminded everyone why he'd become a star in the first place. When Elvis finished, Jimi nodded slowly. "That was beautiful, really. But let me ask you something. When you sing that song, what are you trying to make people feel?" "Loneliness, the ache of missing someone, the hope that maybe they miss you too." "Right. Now I'm going to play something. I'm not going to sing any words, but I want you to tell me if you feel what you just described."
Jimi started playing. At first, it was quiet, almost fragile. Single notes, spaced out, with long gaps between them. Each note had a vibrato that made it waver, like a voice on the verge of tears. He was using the tremolo bar to make the notes cry, to give them a human quality. Then he built a melody, slow, searching, asking questions. The guitar was having a conversation with itself, one voice calling out, another answering from a distance. The tone was clean, but somehow aching. Every note bent just slightly sharp or flat, creating tension that never quite resolved. Elvis stood perfectly still, watching Jimi's hands. The technique was unlike anything Scotty Moore did. Jimi was pulling sounds from the guitar that seemed impossible, using feedback not as noise but as sustained emotion, making harmonics bloom like ghosts of notes that should have already died. The melody shifted into something that sounded like a memory, a phrase that kept trying to complete itself but couldn't quite get there. It was musical loneliness, the feeling of reaching for something that wasn't there. Jimi bent a note so far it almost broke, holding it until the pain was unbearable, then releasing it into a cascade of gentler notes that felt like resignation. He played for about 3 minutes, building and releasing tension, telling a complete emotional story without a single word. When he finished, letting the last note fade naturally, the room was silent. Elvis's expression was difficult to read. He was looking at Jimi, then at the guitar, then back at Jimi. "That's," Elvis started, then stopped. "How did you do that?" "The guitar is just another voice," Jimi said quietly. "It's not better than singing, it's not worse, it's just different. But if you learn its language, if you understand what each technique can express emotionally, you can make it speak." "Play something else," Elvis said. "Something angry." Jimi switched his tone settings, added more distortion, and launched into a furious passage that sounded like rage given form. The notes were harsh, attacking, the feedback controlled but aggressive. It sounded like arguing, like someone finally saying everything they'd been holding back. It was cathartic and unsettling. Then, without warning, Jimi shifted into something tender, a melody so gentle it was almost a whisper. The contrast was shocking. It was like watching someone's anger collapse into vulnerability, the moment after a fight when you realize you're just hurt and scared. Elvis sat down on the edge of the stage, still watching. Steve Binder had quietly signaled the cameraman to start filming, sensing this was something special. "Show me how you do that," the crying sound. Jimi walked over and demonstrated his technique, how he used the tremolo bar in combination with finger vibrato, how he controlled feedback by positioning himself relative to the amp, how he used the volume knob on the guitar itself to create dynamics that mimicked breathing. It's not just about playing notes, it's about phrasing. Like when you sing, you don't just hit pitches, you shape them, you breathe, you add personality. Same with guitar. Every note has a lifespan. It's born, it lives, it dies. How you control that lifespan is how you express emotion.
Elvis asked questions, technical ones about equipment, philosophical ones about approach. For 45 minutes, the rehearsal forgotten, Elvis Presley and Jimi Hendrix sat on that stage and talked about the nature of musical expression. "You know what you made me realize?" Elvis said eventually. "I've been thinking about music wrong. I thought there was a hierarchy, voice at the top, instruments supporting. But that's not it. Every instrument is a voice, including the actual human voice. We're all just trying to say something that matters." "And your voice is incredible," Jimi said. "I could practice guitar for 1,000 years and never make it sound as pure as when you sing. You have something I don't have, but maybe I have something you don't have too. That doesn't make one better. It makes us different parts of the same language." Something shifted in Elvis in that moment. The comeback special had been designed to prove he was still relevant, still the king. But sitting there with Jimi, Elvis realized he'd been approaching it wrong. He didn't need to prove anything. He needed to be authentic. "I want to change the show," Elvis said, turning to Steve Binder. "I want it raw, less polish. I want people to feel what I'm feeling, not just see a performance." Steve nodded, understanding. "We can do that." Elvis looked back at Jimi. "Will you stay? Watch the rest of the rehearsal? I'd value your opinion." Jimi stayed for the next 4 hours. They worked through songs, with Jimi occasionally offering thoughts from a guitarist's perspective, and Elvis incorporating some of what he'd learned about emotional phrasing. At one point, Elvis sang "Trying to Get to You," one of his early songs, but he sang it differently than before, with more rawness, letting his voice crack in places, embracing imperfection in service of emotion. Jimi nodded appreciatively. "That's it. That's what I was trying to explain. You just made your voice do what I make my guitar do. You let it be human." When the day finally ended, Elvis and Jimi exchanged phone numbers. "If you're ever in Memphis," Elvis said, "come by Graceland. I'd like to work with you on something." "I'd like that," Jimi said. They never got the chance. Elvis's comeback special aired in December 1968 and was a massive success. It revitalized his career and showed a more raw, authentic Elvis than anyone had seen in years. But Jimi would die 2 years later, in September 1970, before they could collaborate. However, what happened in that studio had a lasting impact on both of them. For Elvis, it reminded him that being the king wasn't about maintaining some untouchable position at the top. It was about being genuine, about letting people see your humanity. The '68 comeback special worked because Elvis finally let his guard down.
For Jimi, meeting Elvis reinforced something he'd always believed but rarely talked about. That guitar wasn't about showing off or being the loudest person in the room. It was about communication, about finding ways to express things that words couldn't quite capture. Steve Binder later said, "That afternoon changed the entire direction of the special. Elvis came in trying to prove he was still relevant. After talking with Jimi, he stopped trying to prove anything and just started being real. That's why the special worked. People saw the real Elvis, not the movie star." The footage that was captured that day was never officially released. NBC kept it in their archives, unsure what to do with it. Decades later, a few minutes surfaced online, grainy video of Jimi playing that emotional piece while Elvis watched. Music historians call it one of the most important unseen moments in rock history. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend who was there that day, said, "Elvis talked about that afternoon for years. He'd say, 'That Hendrix kid taught me something important, that there's no competition in real music. There's just people trying to express truth in different ways.'" The influence was subtle but real. Elvis's music after 1968 had more edge, more willingness to be vulnerable. Songs like "Suspicious Minds" and "In the Ghetto" showed an Elvis who was willing to let his voice show strain and pain, not just power and control. That was partly Jimi's influence, the understanding that imperfection in service of emotion was more powerful than technical perfection. Jimi, for his part, started talking more in interviews about guitar as a voice rather than just an instrument. "I'm not trying to be the best guitarist," he said in a 1969 interview. "I'm trying to make my guitar say things that matter." Elvis Presley taught me that. His voice was never about technique, it was about meaning. That's what I want my guitar to be about. Noel Redding, Jimi's bassist, said, "After Jimi met Elvis, he started approaching solos differently, less about flash, more about saying something. He'd tell me, 'Elvis can make one note mean everything. I should be able to do that with a guitar.'" The tragic irony is that both men died young. Elvis in 1977 at 42, Jimi in 1970 at just 27. But that afternoon in June 1968 captured something essential about both of them: their mutual respect, their willingness to learn from each other, their understanding that art isn't about competition, but about finding truth. Today, when guitarists talk about making their instruments sing, they're talking about what Jimi showed Elvis that day. When singers talk about rawness and vulnerability being more important than technical perfection, they're talking about what Elvis showed Jimi. The two of them, in that brief encounter, articulated something that every musician since has tried to understand: that the point of music isn't to prove you're the best. The point is to make people feel something real. In 1968, the world saw Elvis's comeback special and thought it was about him reclaiming his throne. What they didn't know was that backstage, a 25-year-old guitarist had reminded the 33-year-old king that thrones don't matter. Truth does. And the truth is, a voice can break your heart, but so can a guitar, because both are just tools that human beings use to say, "I'm here. I feel things, and maybe you feel them too." If this story moved you, remember, the next time you hear a guitar solo that makes you emotional, or a voice that makes you believe every word, you're experiencing what Elvis and Jimi taught each other: that music isn't about the tool, it's about the soul behind it. That's the real lesson from the day the king met the god of guitar.